in partnership with the International Society for Stem Cell Research. That group holds the largest annual meeting of the year of stem cell researchers, and it's across the street from Moscone this year, beginning tomorrow. But every year the Society begins their meeting with an event for the public, and that's why we're here this evening. The host and moderator for this evening is going to be Rachel Myrow. Any of you who listen routinely to our local national public radio station, KQED, know her as a regular host and reporter on that station. Rachel?
First, let me introduce you to our distinguished panelists. We've got Timothy Caulfield of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta in Canada, Claude Gerstle, an ophthalmologist and somebody who's going to be talking a lot about what's going on overseas, Jeanne of the Scripps Research Institute here in California, Douglas Sipp of the RIKEN Center for Developmental Biology in Jeanne, and Deepak Srivastava of the Gladstone Institute of Cardiovascular Disease, and he's also at UC San Francisco. So with that, why don't we kick things off with a video presentation and go from there.
I think the greatest challenge of stem cell research is to take a stem cell that can become anything in your body and make it become one single cell type in large number, high purity. My recent research is really targeting the development of a treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and chronic spinal cord injury. All three injury and disease types rolled into one because all three are characterized by the loss of motor neurons, those cells that control all the moving parts in your body, from your the movement of your internal organs to your arms, eyes, blinking, mouth, everything. Now, those diseases have a deficit of motor neurons, so we've identified a therapeutic target, motor neurons. The path to the clinic really begins with preclinical efficacy work. Do your stem cells actually effectively treat an animal model of human disease? So we have to pick that animal model, find an animal model or develop an animal model that mirrors in some way the human condition. We can never do that. Never ever has there been an animal model that perfectly reflects the human condition of a disease state. So all of our models are imperfect, which means that we have to use 2 or 3. So once we find the 2 or 3 that are closest to the human condition, then we transplant our cells in there and decide on dosing, on timing, the quantity of volume that we're putting into the disease state. In addition, we've got to determine what we're going to look for. What are the outcome measures? Are we going to look for leg function after spinal cord injury? Or are we going to look for bladder function, bowel function, sexual function, motor control, sensory control, any portion thereof? The point here is that we don't want to miss an effect. So we have to have multiple outcome measures. We often have to design those outcome measures, talk to the field, and pick methods that others can follow and others can replicate so that one laboratory can back up the work of another. After we've got this thing working, we then have to show that it's safe. So again, we have to pick the right animal models to look for safety. Do these cells cause tumors? Do they cause pain? We recently designed a safety study that contains some 160 outcome measures, 160 analyses of a single rat, 60 to 80 rats in each group. That's a lot of time. It's a lot of students. It's a lot of weekends. It's a lot of birthdays. It's a lot of time to determine if these things are safe, if they're working. And now in spinal muscular atrophy, some very smart people have developed a mouse model of that disease, but it dies within 14 days of birth. That's not so bad if you're transplanting mouse motor neurons into a mouse, because everything moves fast in a mouse. They live and die within 2 years. But to transplant our human cells into the mouse, we have human motor neurons that take months to grow from the spinal cord to their targets, yet we only have 2 weeks to test their function in this animal model, a very appropriate animal model for this clinical disease. So you see, every model is flawed. It means that we need a multiplicity of approaches. Sometimes we have to develop those animal models, and then we need other laboratories to be able to replicate our work using those very same models. So there has to be a continuity across labs. Can stem cell technologies reasonably be applied to the human condition in the foreseeable future? Well, it was only 1998 where that human embryonic stem cells were first isolated. In a few short years thereafter, methods of differentiating them became known. Just 2 years ago, we had our first high-purity derivation from human embryonic stem cells, done in a clinically viable manner in my laboratory here at UCI. Now we're starting to see the derivation of multiple high-purity human cell populations. Heart cells have been made. Pancreatic islet cells have been made. Oligodendrocytes, motor neurons, retinal tissue. We're starting to see the derivation of useful products and their application to animals. So now what the field is trying to do is figure out how we design the preclinical work. What do we have to do by way of efficacy and safety in order to get these into humans? But we have developed the technologies. That's very, very impressive in a few short years. So stem cell technologies will be applied in the very near future to human conditions. It's no doubt.
So there we have from UC Irvine a discussion of best practices, the difficulties of designing preclinical work in a manner that others can follow, can replicate. Who wants to take this one on first?
I thought that was a wonderful and very balanced video. It really shows both the reason we should be so excited about stem cell research and really the incredible pace at which it has developed. It's only been 10 to 12 years, and we have all these advances that have occurred. So we should be genuinely excited about it. But it also, what I like, is it also really showed the incremental nature of scientific discovery and how each things are really unfold very slowly. You don't know the direction it's going to take. You don't know what the barriers are going to be. And in addition to the barriers that were outlined in the video, he didn't even talk about some of the regulatory, by that I mean legal barriers to taking this stuff into the clinic, which are significant. You have to go to the FDA. You got to get approval for this if we're going to use it on a mass scale. So I thought it was a very nice representation of the state of play. I'm curious what my colleagues think.
One of the very important things about research is the role of serendipity. We don't necessarily know how an experiment is going to turn out and where it's going to lead us. For instance, we've been trying to treat some retinal diseases, something called macular degeneration, using transplantation of cells called retinal pigment epithelial cells that are they can be derived from stem cells. And we're finding out that sometimes the cells can be helpful for reasons that we didn't anticipate, that they can just provide a general nutrition instead of because they've been able to replace the function of these cells that have been lost. So at this stage, we never, it's what makes a great scientist is his ability to notice things that are different from what he expects and to pick up on that. And that's really going to lead us to many different directions that will help us much more in the future.
You've mentioned one surprise for researchers in recent years. Can anybody talk about some other surprises that have come up, things people didn't anticipate finding?
So one of the biggest surprises, I've worked in developmental biology for, I hate to think of it, 30 years, something like that. And I thought I knew everything about this sort of thing, and just about everything about stem cells. And then a scientist called Jeanne came along just a couple of years ago, and discovered that there was a way to make cells, any cells, like skin cells, for example, look almost exactly like embryonic stem cells that are pluripotent. And that really threw me for a loop. It took me a while to get used to the idea. I think many of my colleagues didn't believe it at first. But now it's so common that we have undergraduates reprogramming cells. So I think that was the biggest surprise.
In
In terms of the video and highlighting an item on that, the idea that most animal models are imperfect and typically fail to recapitulate the human disease process is something that's been a roadblock both in scientific discovery related to human disease and in drug discovery related to human disease. And over again, we've seen that we've been able to treat a mouse with the drug, and then that $100 million or $1 billion later, that medicine fails in humans. And part of the problem is that we've been doing that on non-human cells, doing drug discovery. And so the discovery that Dr. Loring just mentioned of being able to take the skin cell from a patient and reprogramming it into a stem cell has really opened up the field to new approaches to understanding human disease, because we can now take that stem cell from the patient with disease and turn it back into the cell type that was affected by disease in that individual, whether it's a heart cell or a brain cell or a liver cell. And now scientists have a cell from the patient with disease of the same type that's affected in that disease, and here is where we can learn about the disease and screen for drugs on a human cell to try to prevent that disease. And there's a lot of excitement that this discovery and that approach will revolutionize our approach to understanding human disease and finding cures.
Well, Doug, last but not least.
So just to follow up on something that Tim mentioned, which is that there are, of course, regulatory issues as well, not just the scientific challenges. There are hurdles on the regulatory side. I don't like the idea that these are barriers, but rather these are pathways that are set up so that interesting and exciting discoveries can then be shepherded into something that actually is a safe and effective treatment in the case of biomedical discoveries. Clearly with stem cells, there are a lot of things that we don't know are going on, might happen in the human body. There have been some exciting results from preclinical tests in animals, but there have also been a number of reasons for concern that people should move slowly and cautiously so that bad things don't happen when they start being injected into humans. So there have been cases, of course, you've probably heard that some types of stem cells give rise to tumors. There are questions about their genetic stability. There are questions about some stem cells migrate through the body, and it's not necessarily clear where they're going to end up. We don't necessarily know whether stem cells are going to proliferate into exactly the right number. Maybe they're going to make too many cells, even if it's of the right type, so you would get a condition of something like hyperplasia. So all of these possible problems need to really be looked at in a very well designed and well regulated way in order to prevent disasters from happening. And of course the second question that's, I would say, also very important is to determine whether things are made available for patients, whether they're going to actually work in the way that people think that they're going to work. So not just about the safety issues, but about what they call the efficacy issues, whether it actually effectively treats the disease or the medical condition that is being marketed for.
I'm going to ask the audience to begin to marshal your questions for the panel. You'll note that there are two mics in either aisle, and that's where we're going to ask you to come forward with your questions. And while you're getting yourselves ready for that, let me ask you another question following on what you just said about thinking of regulation and regulators not as barriers, but, if you will, sort of providing the borders for the debate. Are American regulators, in your opinion, moving fast enough? Are they following the research with the scientists who are conducting it?
I would say that yes, the basic rules and regulations that have been put in place primarily by the FDA do a pretty good job about addressing what the regulatory or the clinical pathway would be that would take a biomedical discovery into a medical innovation. One of the problems I think that the FDA has confronted is that it has limited funding, it has a limited number of people, it has a very broad remit, so there are lots of other things that the FDA has to do which have nothing to do with stem cells. They have to be able to allocate enough people to this such that when promising preclinical discoveries or preclinical data comes online, that they're able to devote the appropriate amount of resources to actually channeling it through all the phases of the regulatory pathway.
Jim, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I agree completely with everything Doug said. The other thing you have to remember that there really isn't that much pressure on regulators right now around stem cell therapies. I mean, the science just isn't there yet. We're trying to get into the clinic, and people anticipate there's going to be a lot of pressure. But I think it's important to note that right now it's the science that is, let's not call it a barrier, but the challenge. And we're hopeful that there's going to be a lot of pressure on entities like the FDA soon, because that means that things are getting ready to move into the clinic.
And I should note that CIRM is, for example, CIRM here in California is working very closely with the FDA because they do have clear intentions to start taking some of their most promising data and taking it into clinical trials. And so they do want to work with the FDA, and so they do have formal discussions with them, bringing in scientists from not only California but around the states, and talking about what are the possible things that scientists and regulators should be looking for in a well-designed trial.
Claude, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to add that when we look around the world, people have to understand that scientific discovery is a slow process, and at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of cooperation between scientists around the world. Meetings like the ISSCR meeting we're having now is an opportunity for those scientists to come together and discuss their discoveries. There's really nothing being hidden. The scientific community in this area is incredibly open, even with dialogue with scientists from Iran and other places that we might not immediately think of trying to do good research.
And feel free to start walking up with your questions. I'll just ask one more. California's obviously invested $3 billion, a heavy investment in seeing this science move forward. Where else would you say are the hot spots for research right now?
Certainly, California, the investment from the taxpayers has propelled the science in California in a way that I think people could only dreamed of years ago. There has been a very significant investment in the stem cell area in the Boston area, and there are fabulous scientists there making really important discoveries, and around the world as well. In Singapore comes to mind, the UK, and Jeanne, maybe others. China.
Australia, China. I think this is one thing that CIRM has done for us is to give us a unique opportunity to exploit the best scientists all over the world. And there actually are some partnerships that allow us to do that. For example, there's a partnership with the state of Victoria in Australia, in which we do part of the work and they do part of the work. We do it in a collaborative way. So I think that this has really become a worldwide science, literally a worldwide science. And I think those of us who work in this field are absolutely delighted by the opportunities that provides to us.
Well, let's start with the audience. Please tell us who you are.
Good afternoon. My name is John Templeton here in San Francisco. There's a new book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I'd like for the panelists to discuss the ethical ramifications of whether patients should be aware of how their cells might be used and reprogrammed into stem cells, and whether, for instance, vulnerable populations should benefit from the proceeds of the research that's generated from these cells.
It's a great question, and in fact, we're having a whole session tomorrow morning at the ISSCR. The ethical team is going to get together and talk about that very issue, about what are the ethical issues around the use of cells and stem cell research, particularly around IPS work, the induced pluripotent cell work that was discussed earlier. Absolutely, people should be informed, and I think that book is a wonderful cautionary tale about what can happen, the trust that can be lost. And that loss of trust has a damage not only obviously for the patients involved, but the entire field. So I think there's a growing understanding, a growing appreciation of the care that needs to be taken in getting appropriate informed consent. And that's challenging, right? Because the normal rules may not apply. I mean, how do you get informed consent when you don't know how the cell is going to be used in the future? So there's some real genuine challenges, but I think there's real efforts by the scientific community to sensitize the issues, and they respect what needs to be done to do it right. And there have been a number of interesting cases. There's been the case in Arizona with the tribe there whose cells or DNA was perhaps used inappropriately. The case in Texas with the neonatal testing again, perhaps the consent mechanisms weren't entirely appropriate. So I think now is a good time to be talking about this, and the stem cell community does not want to make mistakes that perhaps have been made elsewhere.
So let me comment on that too. I've written informed consents, and so I've thought really a great deal about what people need to know and the possibilities for what we might use the cells for. And I think I see it as a teaching opportunity because it allows us to explain to the patients, or the volunteers rather, we don't yet have patients, what stem cells are. And so we have a lot of community outreach that has come from the fact that we need a better informed consent. And then the informed consent, of course, needs to be approved by a committee called the IRB at our local institution. So the process is really evolving, but I think the most important aspect of it is the opportunity to teach people about, and also get people involved in science, young people. Because, I mean, this is fascinating stuff.
Rachel?
Yes.
I should know that CIRM has addressed this issue of diverse and vulnerable populations in a white paper about how we want our research community to think about it, and that is available on our website.
Excellent. And with that, I'm reminded that these packets that you see on your chairs, if you want to read more about the panelists and their scientific backgrounds, you can find out more. We just sort of charged into the conversation. But Doug, did you have something you wanted to add on this question? Or?
I was just trying to say Japan is a little bit this way.
I just wanted to add that this
Claude,
goes back to some recent discussions about Henrietta Lacks, yes. Whether there is can be a financial interest, and certainly if someone has a unique cell that's being utilized, that's a very real question. Who should benefit financially from this research, and does the donor, original donor, share in that?
And Sarah, you're right there.
Thank you, and Laura with you. This weekend, the New York Times had an article on 10 years with human genome. We haven't seen all the things that were promised 10 plus years ago. If you want to go back even further, there was gene therapy, and that hasn't really proved itself. Why are things going to be different this time around?
Tim?
I always want to jump in first. Maybe that's a mistake. Again, another great question. And you know what? They may not be any different. That's science. That is science. You just don't know the direction it's going to go. You don't know how things are going to play out. And in fact, I think it's sometimes healthy to take the view of the skeptic and always critique the way the science is being presented in popular culture. But having said that, I think that this is a field that does hold a tremendous amount of promise, and I think if I was going to map it against, I'm curious what my colleagues think. There's some stem cell scientists here. If you were going to map it against genetics, it has had some big breakthroughs. iPS cells being just one of them. I think it does show a tremendous amount of. I've been very involved in the genetics debate also. I do think it has a lot of promise, but we don't know what the scientific barriers or challenges may be in the future, so it could be 50, 60 years, but I believe that we're at a minimum going to learn a lot about science, and we don't know what the benefits are going to be if we go back.
Let's see, Doug, Claude, who wants to go first?
Before we dismiss things like gene therapy, trials are starting this year treating retinitis pigmentosa, a severe blinding disease that affects young people, using gene therapy, and it's very exciting. So you have to have a much longer timeline than most of us are used to. Remember, the war on cancer started, 40 years ago, and it's an ongoing war, but tremendous headway has been made, despite what the recent New York Times article has said about the results from the Human Genome Project. We have to start with understanding. We're just learning how each cell has the same, in your body has the same genetic complement, but look at all the different types of cells in your body, look at the different organs. There's a lot more that we have to learn about how information is shared between cells, how essentially they communicate so that they know to become a liver, depending on where they are in the body, versus a kidney. And we're learning a lot about that. We're learning a lot about what are called signaling pathways. And one of the amazing things, and we talked about what amazes you in serendipity, is that the same pathway may be used in different tissues of the body at different times in development to do very different things. The human genome is only 30,000 genes, but it has evolved to be able to do incredible things with what is kind of a small information set. And these are things that we have to work out now. And these are things that we hope to learn through stem cell research.
Doug and then Deepak.
So just to follow up on your question, why are stem cells particularly promising? One thing I think that distinguishes them to the other types of innovative technologies you're talking about is that there are some cases where stem cells are already being used medically. The most famous of these, of course, is bone marrow transplantation, which has been in use, again, also for several decades, maybe as many as 40 years. These are not isolated stem cells in most cases. They are a tissue that contains stem cells, which is then either injected back into the same patient or in some cases transplanted from one patient to another. Similarly, there have been success stories with skin grafts and bone grafts, which also do contain native complements of stem cells. And in recent years, there's been some excitement about the regeneration of the cornea using limbal stem cells, which are the stem cells that reside in the eye and which actually naturally give rise to cornea. But again, cautionary note, in all of these cases, what has been done is they ask the stem cell to do the job that it normally does anyway. So blood stem cells give rise to blood, or skin gives rise to skin, or the cornea gives rise to more cornea. What the next step that a lot of people are looking forward to as a future of stem cells in medicine is to use stem cells to give rise to a type of cell that either they wouldn't normally do, or to ask pluripotent stem cells, which can give rise to all the different types of cell in the body, to create a specific single type of cell, like Hans Gerstle was talking about with the motor neurons, so that you can get a pure population that can then be transplanted to replace a population that's either damaged or deficient.
Your question's a very good one. I get asked that question a lot. And so last year I actually decided to make a slide addressing that question. And what that slide has on it is a timeline of many of the important medical discoveries of the last century. In almost every case, if you take the time frame between the initial basic science discovery and the first treatment in a patient, depending on the discovery, it's between 20 and 30 years. So am I surprised that we don't have any major things from the Human Genome Project as yet? No. We're 10 years into it. In the next 10 years, what you'll see is the ability to not sequence one human genome, but every genome, the genome of everybody in this room. And that's what will then lead to the correlation between genetics and disease. That is now on the horizon. That'll happen by the next year or two. In the stem cell area, we're 12 years, one could say, into the discovery of human embryonic stem cells, the ability to culture them in 1998. Am I surprised that in 2010 that we haven't treated people with it? Absolutely not. Am I encouraged that in the same 20 to 30 year time frame we will use those cells to address human disease? Absolutely. So I don't know that it'll be any different, but I think that's okay. this is the pace of science.
Jeanne?
Yeah, I just wanted to try to resurrect the Genome Project just a little bit and tell you what the Human Genome Project has done for stem cell research, which is quite remarkable. So the Human Genome Project, which was the sequencing of all the 3 billion letters in our genetic code, led to another project which was called the HapMap Project, in which the idea was to capture all the genetic diversity in the world, to try to figure out what makes different ethnicities different from each other. And then that in turn, just keep following me here, has led to a project that several people are involved in to create a genetically diverse panel of induced pluripotent stem cells. Because if these cells are to be used as transplants, they need to match the person they're being given to. And if we have a lot of genetic diversity in our stem cell populations, then we can treat more patients. But even more importantly, there are a lot of drugs that affect certain ethnic groups in much different ways. They can be toxic to one group and work perfectly fine in another, and then in a third group, they'll have no effect whatsoever. And so and early, and I think very soon, these pluripotent stem cells will be used in testing the toxicity of drugs in the lab when the drugs are being developed. And so we'll be able to identify drugs before they go out on the market that are liable to cause adverse reactions in a particular ethnic group.
And I know I spotted somebody who had a question over here.
Thank you for doing your research. I came a couple minutes late, but I really, really appreciate your work and all the work. Thank you. Okay, this is a little convoluted, and it has 2 parts. I don't know if you know, but there's a new retrovirus was found this year called XMRV. And, there's only 3 retroviruses. There's AIDS and one for prostate, blah, 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 okay? And the XMRV is definitely connected to prostate cancer. But my issue is they think, and there's studies that have shown that chronic fatigue syndrome is also related to XMRV. And the Whitmore-Peterson lab has shown that. And what's happening now, by the way, in the United States is people are going in groups down to Panama and Costa Rica for stem cells. And they have had some good results with this. And chronic fatigue syndrome is extremely disabling. And I have a daughter that's bedridden. So we wonder if somebody could take this on.
Well, this raises, the question at the heart of tonight's panel discussion, which is that 8 to 18 years is a very long time if somebody somebody you love has a debilitating disease. And it creates a certain urgency, a certain impatience to move things along. We're going to be going shortly, actually, let me see how close we are, in just a couple of minutes to a video starring Jeanne Loring right here. That's going to be talking about some of the issues with stem cell tourism. But just ahead of that, is there anybody who wants to sort of introduce this video for us? Jeanne, would you like to make a comment, or am I putting you on the spot?
The video kind of introduces itself. I was asked to comment on a subject we call stem cell tourism, and that is exactly what it is.
Yes, yeah, there's several
people
groups
going
going
outside the country to get stem cell transplants. So I think that this video will introduce a discussion which should be quite interesting about the concerns we have.
Sure.
So with that, let's play this video, because I do think, like Jeanne says, it kicks us off into the next stage of this discussion.
Since I am involved in trying to bring stem cell therapies to the clinic, I've become very concerned about stem cell tourism. And stem cell tourism is a exploitation of the promise of stem cells. People are going overseas to get treatments that promise cures using stem cells. The reason why stem cell therapies are offered outside the United States is because the United States has very, very rigorous oversight over the development of any kind of drug or treatment of this kind. The people who want to use the cells in a treatment have to spend years testing those cells in culture dishes, making sure that they're not dangerous, making sure that they don't carry any viruses or that they will cause any damage at all. In the United States, you cannot just decide that you think something might work and try it on people. That's forbidden. However, in other countries, that is not so closely regulated. All of these overseas stem cell clinics offer patient testimonials. Many of them are videos. People will say they feel much better. I had heart disease and now I can walk an entire block. What you will not see is any scientific evidence. There will be no FDA investigation of those treatments. There will be no scientific literature that can be read by scientists and agreed upon. And there'll be no guarantees whatsoever that you will be helped by that treatment, and no guarantees that you won't be harmed seriously by that treatment. If you really look into the cells that are being offered by these overseas clinics, you'll find that they can be virtually anything. Sometimes they come from placentas, human placentas. Those aren't stem cells, those are placenta cells. There are other groups that will use umbilical cord stem cells, which are fine for certain applications, but no use at all for neurological disease. There's at least one company that takes organs out of fetal rabbits and they inject them into people. You should at least be informed that the stem cells that you're getting are not human. If you decide, in spite of all the warnings, to go overseas and have a stem cell therapy, I'm asking you if you will ask the clinic to collect a sample of the stem cells they intend to use. You can freeze it and send it to me. I will analyze it for free, and I will tell you what those stem cells are. And that will give you some indication about whether those stem cells are going to be dangerous or that they may be helpful to you. It really breaks my heart to have to explain to people who have critical illnesses or children with autism or parents with ALS that there's nothing we can do right now to help them. And all I can do is to say, please be patient. And if they decide they want to do something overseas, that they should be extremely careful, because I can't guarantee nor can I recommend any treatment that is done that hasn't been proven to be safe.
Let's hear from Doug Sipp, who's prepared a presentation that follows this video quite nicely.
As mentioned before, I work in Japan, and one of the things that I've been doing in the past 3 or 4 years is tracking the growth of this phenomenon that a lot of people call stem cell tourism. I don't really like the term stem cell tourism because in the vast majority of cases, of course, people have no intentions to do any kind of tourist activities while they're going overseas. They're traveling for very serious diseases. Some of them are suffering from diseases for which we have no cure, which are life-threatening. So it's a much more serious phenomenon than a tourist phenomenon. And I'm only going to be talking for 5 minutes, so originally I was not going to make a presentation using slides. But just today, while I was getting kind of warmed up for the talk, I noticed something that I wanted to share with you as a kind of case study about how this phenomenon works. So I was recently a member of a task force in the ISSCR that was tackling this issue. And as part of that, we developed a website. It's an information resource. Someone else is going to introduce that at the end of the meeting. It's called A Closer Look at Stem Cells. And the idea is that it's an authoritative source for patients who are considering getting stem cell treatments overseas. So I wanted to just refresh my memory about what was on that website. And so I Googled it. And you can see here, I don't know if you can see, the pointer's not working very well, but you can see my search terms for A Closer Look at Stem Cells. And the top hit there is the website. But over on the right there, you see the sponsored links. And among the sponsored links, you see one that's called Proven Stem Cell Therapy. So of course I mentioned there are only a few stem cell therapies which are proven, which are for this blood and immune diseases, skin grafts, bone grafts, and corneal implant. But there are lots of clinics, hundreds of clinics around the world, like this one, which is the one that that link links to, the International Stem Cell Institute, which claims that it has a list of responsive conditions. I don't know if you can see on the left there in its menu. And it has some exciting text there that says, you know, if you have cancer, maybe in the future you're going to get a cocktail of bone marrow cells. If you've got spinal cord injury, maybe you'll get a transplant of neural stem cells. And they've got a link here, which they've actually linked to the Exploratorium website, which is an educational, as you probably know, a museum here, which I think has no affiliation whatsoever with this particular company. If you click on that responsive conditions, it now becomes treatable conditions. So we've gone from proven to responsive to now treatable, which is a very empty word in scientific terms. And it has this very long list of 70 or so conditions, most of which would not even be considered to be in the experimental phase in terms of human experimentation. You can see here they have diabetes type 1 and 2, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy. They've got Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, spinal cord injury, all in their list of treatable conditions with what they say they're using placental stem cells. There's clearly very little evidence that this would be possible even in animal models, and certainly none at present that's been published in humans. Then they have a link that talks about basically what are stem cells and what are placental stem cells. And at the very bottom of that page, they have quotes from reputable scientists, members of the ISSCR, people who work in Harvard and the Stowers Institute in Missouri, talking generally about things involved with placental stem cells, but with no indication whatsoever that these types of stem cells could be used for these types of conditions. I'm sure, again, that these people don't know that they've been quoted on this website and would probably be upset to be used in this way. And then for patients who they've gotten interested in, if they've seen their condition there, and they've read a little bit about what stem cells are, they have a financing page so that you can get a medical loan at what they claim is a low interest rate, so that you can actually finance your trip. Most of these trips overseas on average cost between $20,000 and $30,000 US dollars. And they basically inject this patients with something that we don't know what it is, and then send them home to be left to their own devices. So that's the type of link that you can come across even from the top page of a Google result, a search result. And it's the kind of thing that I would argue you would want to avoid. Later, a member of the ISSCR is going to introduce this website, which I think gives a nice authoritative source from the world's premier stem cell society, and is a resource specifically intended for patients who are considering traveling overseas to receive one of these types of injections. Thank you.
So along these lines, CIRM has come up with a list of the top 10 things to know about stem cell treatments. And they include some handy warning signs, when to know to be on your guard. And I'm wondering if anybody on the panel wants to kick off talking about one or two or three of them. Ben?
Sorry. Number one thing to watch out for is using the same procedure to treat a very wide range of diseases, especially if, as you saw in that slide, they appear to be, or apparently, unrelated in terms of the physiology. So if you see one procedure that's intended to cure heart disease and autoimmune diseases and neurological diseases and metabolic diseases, that should set off some very loud alarm bells.
Yeah, I think testimonials, right, Doug, is another thing.
Testimonials is a great one.
Yeah, you should always avoid, if testimonials are the main source of information, they use those for the app flex, and and so the other thing to avoid, I love the example of the quotes that aren't really specific. As you know, that happened to me. I was looking at one of the Chinese websites, and there was this authoritative quote from one of the great minds of the 20th century, me, talking about how beneficial this, and what they did was it wasn't an accurate quote, but it was like one of those quotes where you say, this is a great movie, and they quote that, if you're an idiot. They left me if you're an idiot. Right? So I do think those kind of those really kind of vague quotes from I'm not an expert, but from real experts should be is another clear marker of
local newspaper stories as well. So there are lots of human interest stories that get published by a small town newspaper, which the title will be something like "Local Girl Travels to China for Her Blindness." And it has no critical review of what the state of the science or the state of the medicine is. It's focused around the feel-good aspects of the story. And indeed, there is a real narrative there about parents being concerned about their child's medical condition, wanting to do whatever is conceivable for the child, exhausting all the options, whether they're here or in other countries. And in many cases, relying on support from the community by doing fundraisers or getting support from the church or whatever local organization. So these are all stories that make it sound like this is something that's a legitimate quest. But in fact, and many times you'll see a quote like, we know that it's experimental, but even if it's a 1 in a million chance, we have to take that chance because there's no other options available. But what isn't getting said is that there's a very good likelihood that it's a 0 in a million chance, that there is nothing behind it, that there is no science. Indeed, we don't even know if they're actually injecting stem cells in most of these clinics because they're completely opaque. They're not regulated. They're not subject to inspections. We just don't know what's happening. And you can set up one of these companies with the $150 it takes to make it a website.
I was quite taken, as I think a lot of people in the audience may have been, by a recent 60 Minutes report where the clinical work, such as it was being done in Mexico, but the company was based right here in California. Who's supposed to be in charge of following those companies if they are based in the U.S.?
So there is no one who has the jurisdiction to follow this kind of transnational things, and this is one of it's a globalization of medical. I don't want to call it fraud. Let's call it quackery.
You don't want to get sued.
Yeah. Well, I've been threatened with lawsuits 3 times by companies that I've written about. So it is. I mean, it's a legitimate concern, and it's something I have to choose my words carefully. But yes, you can base a company even here in the U.S. The company I just showed had a 1-800 toll-free number. You can do it with American staff and even the physicians, as long as you don't actually do the medical procedure in the U.S. and you do it in a country that doesn't have adequate either regulations or adequate enforcement of the regulations. Then there is no international organization that has the legal authority to do anything about it. And so that's why it's come down to basically a war of information. Organizations like CIRM and like the ISSCR and like many of these different research institutions that have taken on this problem are now trying to offset the huge amount of bad information that is available on the internet even if you don't go out looking for it like we saw, with good information that's from authoritative, reliable scientific sources who are cautious about the way that they talk about the current state of the science and the future prospects.
Deepak?
I thought I should mention that as a community of scientists and physicians who are dedicated to using the potential power of stem cells to treat human disease, we appreciate the urgency and the desperation that patients feel when traditional medicine has not been able to offer a current solution. And this is a genuine desperation and urgency that patients feel. And I see it as a physician all the time, and I get emails about this all the time from people all around the world. And so we applaud those individuals carrying out efforts around the world that are taking some risk and trying to do innovative things to bring this to therapies. But we also recognize that the individuals who are in that situation of desperation and urgency are the most vulnerable to be preyed upon by those who might want to take advantage of their situation. And unfortunately, that is not uncommon. And so the best thing we can do, I believe, is to provide the information so that people can begin to distinguish those that might be trying something out that is new and maybe not approved, but might have some validity, versus those that are really just preying on people in at their stage of desperation.
You know, Claude.
Oh, I was just going to say that one prominent Chinese center has now states that they've treated over 8,000 patients, and when you think about it, if there were 8,000 patients having these wonderful results in reality, I think we would have heard a lot more about it, and that if they charge an inordinate amount of money for their treatment, if they had such a wonderful treatment, that they would probably lower their cost and share it with the rest of us.
Well, the cost, the clinic that he's talking about is located in Shenzhen, China. It's called Baker Biotechnology. They've kind of gone a bit underground, or they've gotten a lot quieter about their claims that they make publicly on their website. But the cost is a very key component of the economics of this phenomenon. So if you have 8,000 patients and you're charging what they charge, which is about $25,000 a person, if you do the math, that's about $200 million. So if you think about that, there's a very clear motivation for these clinics to stay in business and to skirt regulations and to do everything they can to avoid doing clinical trials, because there is a risk, of course, when you do a clinical trial, that you're going to get a result that shows that it's either not safe or not effective. And so a lot of these companies, that's one of the biggest ones, are taking this as their route to profitability.
Something I've noticed in the comment sections under stories, under broadcast segments dealing with stem cell tourism is the concern that drug companies are somehow rigging the setup for their benefit. And given that there are so many negative stories about large companies doing bad things, I wanted to put that question to the panel. Tim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. I've received emails from people who've read some of the work I've done on this, claiming that I've been bought out by the drug company. I wish I was, because I haven't been offered anything. But I think it's I can understand that deep skepticism about the involvement of the drug. And it's almost like a conspiracy theory, right? This idea, you hear around cancer too, if you can keep cancer going, we make money off cancer, so we don't want to cure cancer, the same thing here. I think that's what makes a website like the ISSCR so valuable, because it's as independent as possible. Why the conflict of interest that clearly exists with these companies that are making $200 million somehow is not as profound as me and Doug getting bought off by drug companies. I'm not sure why that doesn't play out that way, but I think the key here is independent information that people can trust. And right now, I think one of the closest things we have is the new ISSCR website. Doug, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, of course, the other source of information is peer-reviewed literature, but the problem with that for the general public, there are several problems. One, that it's written in a very dense scientific language. And the other problem, of course, is that it's very expensive to get access to most of these things. So it becomes very difficult to determine whether somebody is making a claim that's justified by the actual published scientific literature or not. And some companies have gotten smart to this idea that people are now sensitive to the need for peer-reviewed literature, and they're beginning to use journals which will allow them to basically publish if they pay the publication fee, and they use those as a marketing tool. So they publish fairly weak publications in very low impact journals, and then put those on their websites as a type of justification for the types of claims that they're making on their website.
Can you recommend, I know the last time I touched biology was high school, and I'm not going to be able to read those scientific journals. Are there publications geared towards the general public that deliver good science, so that at the very least one can have a context from which to gauge the latest developments that you hear about?
The ISSCR patient handbook is a good start, and a lot of the funding agencies like CIRM, actually I'm not sure about NIH, the Stem Cell Network in Canada. If you go to those websites, they often have a public link where they talk about the basics. I know the Stem Cell Network in Canada has that, and they also have links where they provide sort of basic information about all the ethical and policy issues, and they're aimed directly at the public in the hope of informing them. And again, they try to be independent sources of information.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon as well, and when there's a stem cell paper that comes out that has, a scientific paper that comes out that has some note something of note. The press often picks it up, and there are many reporters who are excellent writers who can write about science very well. And we're not talking about the hometown papers now, we're talking about the New York Times. And so I actually learned quite a bit from those reporters' stories in fields outside my own, and I've been very impressed with the quality of their reporting on stem cells.
But I think it's important for people who are not scientists and not clinicians to keep in mind that there are going to be limits to the amount of knowledge that they're going, realistic knowledge that would be the basis for a medical decision that they're going to be able to get from searching the internet and from reading these kind of patient guidebooks or kind of primers on stem cell biology. At some point, I think patients, even ones who have been told by their doctors that there is at present no reputable cure or reputable treatment for a condition, have to take a step back and look, well, if the doctors, the people who are professionals at this field and who have gone through medical education are telling me that it doesn't exist, is it likely that it's going to exist in some place like Costa Rica or in Thailand or in the Ukraine, which is, in terms of scientific research, is certainly not one of the great producers of new innovations.
We'll start with the...
And people need to be, people need to be careful about basically taking medical decision-making too much into their own hands. I think patient empowerment and patient autonomy is a great thing. It's something that's developed more and more in recent years, but you don't want to overreach. A lot of people wouldn't make decisions about their car that they're now making about their body or their children's bodies.
We'll start with you, sir.
Thank you. I'm John Chisholm, and Claude, it's great to see a fellow member of the MIT Corporation Development Committee on the panel.
Thank you.
For every life that is saved by prohibiting or postponing a therapy, some number of other lives will be lost by prohibiting or postponing the same therapy for people for whom it might be helpful. How do you make those trade-offs? And what rights and choices should the patients themselves have in the matter? Patients who are dying are quite rightly less risk-averse than the normal population. And so shouldn't they have the right to make these trade-offs with their physicians? Also, what if someone can't afford to travel overseas?
Tim?
A traditional role. First of all, I think we need to be careful. That's, again, great point. And I hear this a lot from when I speak to the general public about these issues. I think it's a very interesting dilemma, but we're not even at the stage where that we have that dilemma. We're not at the stage, the science isn't at the point where, you know, we're keeping it from the public. And I think there's often that perception that our regulatory system is somehow keeping useful and powerful stem cell therapies from the public because of regulation and ethical concerns, et cetera. We're not there yet. We may be there someday, in which case there are interesting issues around clinical trials, how clinical trials are run, the idea between running a clinical trial and doing experimental treatment that I think are going to be tough. There are going to be answers, there are going to be tough questions that are going to need to be answered by the exact kind of balancing that we may need to do, but we're not there yet with stem cell therapies.
Yeah. So
Doug, do you want?
Even present-day clinical trials, the way that it works is that the evaluators of the proposal will take into account the balance of risk and benefit and what would be considered an acceptable risk given the severity of the condition. So it's something that's already incorporated into the way decisions are made about the funding of, the approvals of clinical trials. And following up on what Tim was saying, it's important to remember that what people who are highlighting or exposing these types of poorly regulated and uncontrolled stem cell claims are doing is not trying to impede the freedom and the autonomy of patients. What we're trying to do is to remove the ability of people to exploit them and to possibly steal money from them and to jeopardize them by doing things that we just clearly don't know are going to be safe or effective, and which in many cases clearly would have some substantial risk involved given the state of the science today.
I'd just like to add that it's not just the patient's money often. All too often we've seen patients having fundraisers to fund their trips abroad, and it puts very heavy pressure on not only family, but friends, business associates to contribute to something that's not only futile, but just plain wrong. And it goes beyond that. Also, we're talking about if most of that $250 million, say, came from patients from the United States, about half of that is funded from the general taxpayer because of the write-off for medical treatment. So it hurts all of us, and it's becoming a very expensive and very serious problem.
With that, lady here.
Hello, I'm from Sweden. I'm a scientist, and I'm among the scientists that characterized the adult neural stem cell in your brain in 1999, the first publication on the adult neural stem cell. I now also work very closely with the regulatory authorities. And I think that is important that the scientists do that. You will see, actually, that also in Europe there are clinics that are offering stem cell remedies. And I would, of course, warn you also against those clinics. Now, I also understand that you are all wondering how come they can exist and how can they make the claims. The reason is that in some countries they had already certificates to produce certain therapies before we had the legislation in place in Europe. So some of these clinics, some of them are located, for example, in Germany. I will not say any particular name now, but they had the right to produce certain therapies in one of the states in Germany long time before the legislation was in place. So it's very tough because even if we would like to do something to enforce rules, we cannot do it. But we will be able to do it next year because there is a time limit in Europe that by 2011 all the countries should follow the directives of the advanced therapies, those like, for example, stem cell therapies. So if you see any of these clinics that are offering stem cell cures in Europe now, you will not see them presenting what they are doing in the same way, because next year legislation will have reached a point where actually this becomes not something to do. But this is the situation, I think, also from the regulatory offices, that it's not so easy. You're always one step behind. And if there are certain companies, they do have a certain certificate, a right to produce something that was not considered medicine in the past. Suddenly, we have to change legislation also to work against those not very serious initiatives. So if you see, for example, such advertisements in Europe and you say, how can they accept this in the European medicine agencies? Please know that we are going to come to the same level and they are going to be stopped, but it takes time. And I think we need to start within our own continents, within our own countries, to see what we can do also to stop these therapies. I do not think it is okay just to say, oh, those are initiatives far away from here in other continents. I think we have to start right now where we are Why can't we, for example, stop these initiatives you talk about in California, where everything is arranged here except for the treatment, but then you cross the border? I think we have to advance legislation more and to protect the future, hopefully very efficient therapies.
Let's put that question to Doug. I mean, presumably you've been in contact with regulators, maybe even law enforcement officials, about following some of the research. What do they tell you about their ability to enforce the law here?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know in too much detail about why they're not able to do it. However, I've been told by people at the FDA that there are limits to what they can do once people move outside of the borders of the U.S. And this is actually probably the case. And Tim is a professor of law, so he can probably actually answer this better than I. But in most cases, national laws don't actually, they're not enforceable outside of the borders.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I think that what we need to do is create. It's very difficult to regulate an internet-based industry. Look at the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry. I mean, there's a whole variety of examples of that. So I think the best thing we can do is create norms that the entire world can be held to.
And with that, next question.
Hi, I'm a scientist as well. And my name is Raphael Grodetsky. I'm from Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. I have a remark to make here. Maybe it's not very politically correct, but there is somebody to be blamed. And these are not the clinics there. It's us, the scientific community. Because we build the expectations. I sometimes hear all my fellow scientists around the world, when they invent something or find a new stem cells, they put it as if tomorrow everybody will be cured by these new stem cells, and you can build the tissues and you can regenerate tissues, and everybody puts the reality in such a distorted way that people, even I myself, if I were not in this field, I would be convinced that serious people are really advocating for stem cells therapy, because they said it's just around the corner, while it's not around the corner. And just look at these clinics that are doing all this experimental work. They imitate the work that are done by those experimentalists on animals everywhere. I mean, they didn't invent all this treatment. They just read few papers that were very, very optimistic, and we know that they were over-optimistic. And then they actually, the scientists bake this hot potato, and now we claim that we don't know how come all kind of clinics are using our inventions to treat people when we know you can't treat anybody. We all know that if I cut the tip of my finger, I can't regenerate it if I'm not a salamander. With all kind of stem cells, give me everything you want. I can't really build my tip of my finger unless I use a plastic surgeon and implant it. So how could I regenerate a heart? Still, I go around the world and I see people saying, around the corner, we have already tissues, beating tissues, so forth, and we regenerated the heart. So the clinic's using it because there is a lot of optimism, and they inject the cells, and the heart are regenerating somehow in those clinics.
Tim, I take it you want to comment on
Yeah,
that?
I mean, this is it's a fantastic comment, and it's one of my favorite topics, and our institute has actually done a lot of research on this. And we call it the cycle of hype. And I don't think any one individual or one entity is to blame for this. You know, it's not the scientist's fault, it's not the institute. There's this pressure on the scientific community to justify their work in short-term basis. They've got to get funding. It's getting incredibly competitive to get funding. And in the context of stem cells, the cycle of hype was even more intense because there was at the beginning in particular, this moral debate about it, right? So the arguments for stem cells, why it's important, why we need to move forward, the rhetoric was heightened. You know, we're going to be saving lives. We have a moral responsibility to let this research to go forward. And I'm not going to say promises were made, but expectations were certainly raised. The press picks up on this, and we've looked at how the press represents stem cell research, and they almost always represent it in a very positive tone outside the moral debate. So you're absolutely right. I have sensed, and we haven't studied this empirically yet, and we're actually want to do that in the near future, I have sensed the tone started to change a little bit. I think that the scientific community is becoming much more careful about saying 2 years from now, 3 years from now. They're more portraying the field, and I think this is accurate, as tremendously promising. But I think that your point is tremendously important, and that the scientific community, people like myself included, have got to be careful how the field is portrayed.
Actually, you made my point here because you say the press know nothing. We feed the press. We bring the press.
Yeah.
I've got to say, I've received press releases.
Yeah. I want to come to the press's. I want to come to the press's defense, actually, because you're 100% correct about that. And we did a study looking at genetics and how genetics was portrayed, and our hypothesis was that you guys did a terrible job. In fact, you do a very good job. And the hype largely comes from the scientific community. And one of the predictors of hype was whether a scientist was quoted, right? Because, you can see how that would happen. If you can get a scientist to say something exciting, it's fair game. So, and it goes. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But the press does play a role. I mean, it's very competitive. And you've got to make a story.
You're also dealing with people who often do not have the education to sort of gauge what they're looking at, and you do see a lot of press releases. I don't even cover health issues, and yet I get press releases all the time with great big words in them and great big promises. And if you read down into the press release, then they'll couch it with things like, this could shed light or inform our understanding of the issue, when the headline says, cure for autism. It takes a lot of careful research to avoid being duped, to avoid being a tool of somebody who wants to get into the headlines.
Yeah. So let me comment on that just a little bit, because I think scientists are certainly to blame, but I would ameliorate that blame somewhat by saying that there's an enormous amount of enthusiasm among scientists to work in this field, especially among young people, and they will work 24 hours a day because this is so exciting. And so I think there is a tendency to say the work I'm doing is really, really important. I think any scientific project has that sort of phase, right?
So people are optimistic. Scientists are optimistic. The public is optimistic. The press plays into that, and they try and write stories in talking about technology development that feed into that. But let's not shift the blame. The blame clearly lies on the shoulders of the clinics that are providing things that they either know are not justified by the data, which are not conducted with any kind of safety oversight or any kind of independent supervision, and which, to my eyes anyway, clearly are seeking to exploit this optimism and exploit the hopes and the fears of people who are confronting very serious, in many cases the most stressful time in their life. They're looking at a state in which, in many cases, there are no better medical options available for their particular condition. And there are people who are, unfortunately, in the world who will prey on that type of consumer. And those are the people with whom the blame lies. Everything else is what enables them, perhaps. But the blame is on the people who actually take advantage of a situation where they can exploit people who are in a very vulnerable position.
With that said, sir, over here.
Yeah, my name's Tim Ryan. I'm the Human Subjects Committee, which is the IRB at the Berkeley Lab. And right now, at least at the lab IRB, we're not seeing much proposed research coming that we would review. I think at some point, as the science evolves and clinical trials become a reality, that we will see more. Just a sidebar to that too, hopefully the scientists involved with stem cell research volunteer to sit on the IRB and be part of that.
I'm having trouble hearing. I'm sorry, if you can speak up.
I'll put it higher. So my last comment, which is the most important, is that the stem cell scientists would volunteer to sit on an IRB to be part of that review process. Because the IRBs really, especially at this stage, don't have the expertise to do the review. I mean, we do have scientists, but again, this is a kind of a novel development in the science world, and having those experts on would be very important. Another point I'd like to raise is that indeed OHRP, which oversees IRBs in the country, does have IRBs overseas that are registered with Office of Human Research Protection in Washington, and they are studying not so much the biologics, but drugs and devices overseas, and they're very careful to ensure that the regulations are enforced and followed protecting human subjects. So just want to share that thought about the IRB.
Anybody want to comment on that? Claude?
No, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last. If you could rephrase the question and speak louder into the microphone, please.
It sounded like a comment more than a question, yeah?
It was a comment. And I guess the IRBs do oversee international research that's funded by the U.S., that's done overseas. And there's also IRBs that are registered with OHRP in Washington that ensures that the subjects are protected, their welfare and well-being and so forth. So that was just a comment.
Sir? Your question?
Yes. I'd like to focus on China once again. We've heard good China and we've heard bad China. On my iPhone, I've got the email from Beike where they have a Christmas sale on stem cells with packages buy one, get one free. I'm not kidding. But this morning at the ISSRC workshop, we did hear encouraging, legitimate results from one of the presenters about spinal cord injuries in South China at a hospital in Kunming. So when patients hear about the good China, it certainly raises expectations that there certainly could be legitimate treatments offered in this country, People's Republic of China, whereas before, as you just mentioned earlier, places like Thailand, Costa Rica, Ukraine, they're not sending scientists to ISSRC conferences. The big revelations, as you said, in Philadelphia 2 years ago was, I believe, from Japan, Dr. Yamanaka's discovery, which raised it. And now there's a lot of, there's a consortium, I've heard now, of hospitals working together in China. And so the second half of my question would be, would California be trying to collaborate in some way with Chinese researchers enabled to bring their expertise into California labs?
We do have a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Science and Technology in China to try to begin those sorts of collaborations. We're not very far along. It's a big and difficult country to work with, but we do hope to have those collaborations going in the future.
And with that, I want to thank you all for your wonderful questions. I know there are probably some more in the audience. I could see some people writing. But we are going to bring this to a close. Melanie has some comments from the ISSCR that she's going to share with us.
Hello, my name is Melanie Praisall, and I'm the Scientific Affairs Manager at the International Society for Stem Cell Research. And at the ISSCR, we are deeply concerned about the issue that we've been talking about with the number of clinics that are offering stem cell treatments overseas, and also very much so for the welfare of the patients who are visiting these sites. And to address this question, we have recently launched this website, which Doug showed you earlier, called A Closer Look at Stem Cell Treatments. And I think as we have all heard about the promise of stem cells, and I think a lot of us here really believe that in stem cells and that one day we will eventually be able to treat a wide variety of human diseases and conditions. But I think what we've also learned tonight is that it takes a lot of hard work and a lot of research to get there. And for most of the conditions that we're talking about, we're just simply not there yet. However, as Doug very effectively demonstrated, that if you were to do an internet search right now for the term stem cell treatment or stem cell therapy, you'd be able to find literally hundreds of clinics around the world that are offering stem cell treatments. And if you go to those websites, the one that he showed you is a very good example. They look very appealing. They look very convincing. But what you'd really find there is a lot of misinformation. And so one of the big goals of this website is to correct a lot of the misinformation that we see out there, and to make sure that people have the facts about what stem cells can and cannot do and what is currently treatable by stem cells. So this information can be found on the page that Rachel referred to earlier. It's called the Top 10 Things to Know About Stem Cell Treatments. And this is the tab page on the left that you find that information on. And here we talk about things about, for example, that that blood-forming stem cells will probably never spontaneously turn into neurons. And we also talk about things like patient testimonials and why that's not scientific evidence, and to be wary of clinics that are using those in their advertisements. So we also think it's important that people understand the process and what it takes to develop new therapies and what it takes to make sure that these therapies are both safe and effective. And to do that, you could go to our How Science Becomes Medicine page, bottom right tab there. And here you'd be able to find information about some of the protections that should be in place to make sure that the rights and the safety of patients who are undergoing experimental treatments are being protected. Other places in the site, you'd be able to find information of how clinical trials are structured, what the purpose of clinical trials are at different points, and also how some of these safety precautions and patient protections developed and why we believe they're so important. But one of the main features of the site, which we haven't talked about this yet, is a mechanism that anybody can go to on the website. You get there by clicking on this orange button at the top there. And what you can do here is submit the name of a clinic that you would like more information about. And the ISSCR will conduct a review of this clinic. We will request that that clinic send us information that they will request that they show us evidence that they have 2 key patient protections in place. One being a medical ethics committee that has approved the treatment. This is what the gentleman over here was referring to before. It's sometimes called an IRB. And the second is oversight by a regulatory agency. That would be an example would be the FDA. And ultimately what we're going to provide is a list of clinics that either can or cannot provide the evidence of these 2 patient protections. And we hope that patients will be able to use this list as well as the other tools on the website to make decisions about stem cell treatments that they may be considering. Thank you very much.
With that, I'd like to encourage CIRM President Alan Trounson to come up and deliver a couple of remarks.
Thank you very much to everybody, the panelists. Been working hard. Rachel, thank you very much for sort of getting the best out of the panelists. And thank you everybody for coming here. The CIRM really wants to make sure that we are interconnected with the community, and also we want to embrace the patients and the patient advocates in a way that is really meaningful. So you mean a lot to us, and if we can make those connections and join with the society and do the kind of things you just saw, then I think we're helping. But we all need your help in some respects, because in delivering this to the patient population, it's going to take a lot of hard work through the regulatory agencies and the linkages with other scientists here in the United States and throughout the world. And we can only do that if we're supported and with the voice of the patient advocates. So it's a terribly important component to us. As scientists, we work hard in the lab. You'll find, I think, scientists being terribly honest. They will, on occasions, be terribly enthusiastic about their research, but you have to be optimistic when you're doing research, because otherwise it would be a deplorable state, I tell you, because there are a lot of blind ends in research, and so you have to remain optimistic. So with that optimism, with what you've given us in terms of money to do this job, and with your help and continuing help, we hope to deliver on some of these opportunities. Time will tell how well we do that, but together we will do it for certain, and I hope that that's going to be meaningful to people in the community as soon as possible. But that soon as possible could be 25 years, or it could be within a few years, and it's most of that we don't really know, and it depends so much on how those trials can be initiated, how well they do, and how well we can make our way up the so-called pipeline that the regulatory agencies insist that we go through. So, and there's good reason why they do that, but I think the point was made this morning that part of the risk is that if you don't get the treatment, that's also a risk. So there is a risk in doing something new, but part of that risk is that we need to be able to get to people as soon as possible. And so, we're determined to do that the best we can, and we welcome your inputs and your input, Rachel, and everybody's working together. It's one big team. So thank you for giving up your evening, and I hope you've been informed by it. Thanks very much.